Hello there, and welcome to episode 16 of your Bamboo Chalupa digital marketing podcast. I am your host, Brett Snyder, the owner of Knucklepuck, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Nate Shiver, the author of shiverweb.com.
Hello, hello.
So for our regular listeners here on Bamboo Chalupa, you know that Nate and I have harped on the importance of tracking and key performance indicators and constantly testing your assumptions as an integral part of your marketing strategy. You know, we've talked about this in almost every single episode that we've done. And at this point, we're pretty sure we've sold you on the benefit of analytics, but it's also important to understand that these metrics need to be taken with a careful understanding, not only of what the metrics themselves say, but really what they mean. And so what we want to frame this episode around is teaching you guys why your analytics are bullshit and what to do about it.
Yeah, and this is important because if you're going to make data-driven decisions, whether it's looking at your landing page report and seeing what kind of content is performing so that you can do that same type of content even more, or if you're just trying to diagnose bounce rate, whatever you're looking at in analytics, it's important to understand exactly what you're looking at. And that's because analytics, it's more than just the numbers that, Google Analytics gives you. It's a story. It's a story of what's happening with your website, what's happening in your market. And it can tell you, why, it can tell you how, and it can also tell you what's next if you understand how it really works.
When we really get into talking about the how and the why and the what's next, it's turning what we kind of call this idea of actual data, just raw numbers, raw information, and turning it into something actionable. Data can be misleading. We can make incorrect assumptions that would lead to inappropriate strategies. And in a lot of ways, especially in SEO, an incorrect assumption that leads to an inappropriate strategy, we may not realize that for 6 weeks down the road, 8 weeks down the road, after we've invested considerable time and resources into that strategy that was based on a faulty assumption.
There's actually a really funny commercial by Adobe. I think it ran a couple years ago. And the scene is set by the CEO. He gets a call from his analytics department and they say, website traffic is up 16,000%. And the CEO says, get the encyclopedia presses running. If this is an encyclopedia company for whatever reason. And so the presses fire up, they're shipping it out, they've got trucks running out, and the camera zooms out, and it turns out that that all the website traffic that they saw in their analytics was a 2-year-old on an iPad repeatedly punching their ad over and over and over. And of course, the punchline is that, they made all these huge decisions that had a huge impact on how their business is run because they didn't know it was just a 2-year-old randomly clicking their ad. And I think there's a lot of truth to that ad. And of course, that's one thing Adobe was selling with it.
Right. And what we want to address with this episode is kind of this overarching misunderstanding of analytics, some of the key things that we want you to look at in your own analytics to be able to recognize what is valuable information that you can make data-driven decisions off of, and what is kind of information that may be skewing or diluting or even compromising the actual analytics of your website.
Yeah. And before we talk about the bad or the misunderstandings of analytics, I want to take a step back and talk about the power of analytics, because I don't want to go overboard and say that your analytics are worthless, because it's important to remember the sheer operation that goes on behind the scenes to get all this information for even the smallest website into a single usable dashboard like Google Analytics. And I think the fact that Google offers this basically enterprise analytics package for free really undersells the value. The fact that you can just go copy paste a piece of code, put it on your site, and instantly know not only visits, but conversion funnels, bounce rate, and all the incredible dimensions that GA tracks.
And Nate and I have talked about this actually at length for quite a while now. And I take a very different approach to this. I think that Google recognizes how valuable this information is about your website. And that's exactly the reason that GA is free. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Google's success as a business, as a search engine, is intimately tied to the overall health of the web. The way that people engage with websites, the way that people use the web is directly related to how Google is able to serve their ads and generate their revenue. By giving website owners this invaluable information about their users, giving them the opportunities to further invest in their website and by extension, investing in the health of the web as a whole, this benefits Google because it helps ingrain this idea of, a web presence being integral to how businesses are run in 2015. So I actually really think that Google making it free is to encourage as many people as possible to use this information because they want to give you everything that is possibly available in terms of tracking so that you can make accurate data-driven decisions for your marketing and your business strategies.
Yeah, and again, it's important to remember that the sheer computing power behind Google, behind the smartest AI that we have, behind the greatest mapping algorithm that we have, is the same type of brains and computing power that's behind analytics. And so even though it's free, like Brett said, the information at its core is right. And you have, some really smart people working on solving a lot of these problems. But the key is to understand what those problems are and what context they're in and how you can use the information that analytics does provide to make the right decisions.
Maybe another way to look at it, it's almost like SEO, where SEO isn't free, SEO is non-paid. The information that you get out of Google Analytics, we don't want to think of it as free because Google is actually giving us this. They're almost investing in us as website owners by giving us this information. We don't pay for it, but it's extremely valuable information, not only for us, but also for Google. Remember, Google Analytics, and I'm sure if anybody has set up a Google Analytics account or profile lately, you see that they auto-select a little checkbox that says to send anonymous feedback to Google. It helps Google understand how people are engaging with your website because they own the platform. They own the dashboard. So that information lives somewhere. That tracking code follows them in cookies and saves their information somewhere. Now, when we think about who owns that information, the more sites that use Google Analytics, the more information that Google has. And now we talk about this idea that Google wants to give us all of this information because it benefits us as website owners, it benefits them as a platform. But this isn't to say that there aren't people or, people out there that are willing to manipulate this information, that are trying to take advantage of the fact that this free platform exists to be able to share information. This isn't something where you're necessarily stealing credit cards, but as kind of the Joker said sometimes, there are people out there who just want to watch the world burn. There are people out there who want to be able to find loopholes that they can potentially exploit. And Google Analytics is one of those things that there's a lot of what we'll call spam bots. There's a lot of these automated programs that can actually compromise the integrity of your Google Analytics that we want to point you in the direction of so that you can recognize not only what they are, but how to go about filtering them out of your profiles.
And I think to make this a little more tangible, I will throw out Semalt.com. I will bet money that anyone listening to this podcast and pretty much any website owner who digs into the referral report in their Google Analytics dashboard will have seen a website, Semalt.com, or Buttons for Websites, or I Love the Tally, Best Website Awards. I can go on and on. And these are
Darodar, 7 Make Money Online. There's a lot of these spam referrers that aren't actual humans going in and clicking on your website, but they are these spam bots that are just triggering the Google Analytics code without actually viewing your website. So it's almost like a less valuable version of that baby button mashing the iPad that Nate referenced earlier.
Oh yeah, because it's, even though these aren't people coming to your website and not doing anything, it's skewing all of your data, especially the referral traffic. But even as the referral traffic spills into, what percentage of your total traffic is driven by each medium. When all these attacks first started, people would see, oh, my referral traffic is up. I must be doing something really, really right off page. I have no idea what Semalt is, but it must be some forum or interesting someone who's linking to my website. And when that starts going up, it's referral traffic is taking up a bigger portion of the 100% total traffic pie, which means organic traffic is going down. And it's just skewing your reporting. And
I think that's a really important thing. I kind of want to hammer that home for everybody listening here, where it's not talking about just that your referral traffic spikes. But by your referral traffic and having, even if it's just, hey, we had a 50% spike in referral traffic from Semalt, I call it Semalt. There's a couple of different, there's different pronunciations, but it's semalt.com if anybody's in their analytics looking for it now. But this skews your overall traffic metrics. It also skews any of these engagement metrics you look at for your entire site. So the bounce rate on these spam bots is 100% because they're obviously not clicking through to other pages on the site. So if you get, say, 1,000 visits to your website, but 200 of them are from the spam bot with 100% bounce rate, your bounce rate for the rest of your site is going to be artificially inflated because of this automated traffic that is in there simply to go and ping the Google Analytics code without actually reflecting a user engaging with the site.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me about just how easily someone can do this. If you go into the Google Developers Guide where they outline, how you can write things like scripts and APIs to tap into Google Analytics data for legitimate purposes like exporting data to a CRM or to a sales management tool, they actually outline how you can trigger your Google Analytics code remotely. And normally that would be for someone, say, at a cash register using Google's measurement protocol. But it's what these guys are doing is basically taking that same script and triggering it remotely. So again, it's not, they're not even limited by manpower. This is just, they can write a script that just runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, on and on, just messing with everyone's analytics. And it's pure spam. And it's good to know that this is an inherent problem with the web and an inherent problem with how analytics are tracked. They're tracked by sessions triggered by that piece of JavaScript that's on your website.
And let's talk about a couple of the other different limitations of Google Analytics, because obviously the spam bot traffic is something where somebody consciously created this bot to be able to go, and they will claim, because there's, SEMalt will put all sorts of documentation about what they're doing and why it's not bad for the web. They've been very defensive about, the value of their business and what they're trying to do. I personally disagree with it. I think most people who use their analytics, to be able to make data-driven decisions would agree with me. But this is an external source that actually went in there and is manipulating the data. Let's talk about a couple of the limitations of Google Analytics itself so that you can recognize what you're looking at when you go back in and check out your web statistics.
Yeah, so the first limitation is going to be sample data. And sometimes this might be something that is triggered that you may not even realize is happening, especially if you're running a small site. And basically, it's the idea is that analytics, they dedicate a certain amount of memory to processing the server logs, that they have for your website. And when that amount is exceeded, then they run an algorithm to sample the data. It's the same idea of polling, where you poll 1,000 people, and the results from that, reflect the general population. But the problem is that in analytics is that a lot of times these aren't as accurate as you would want them to be, or you think they are accurate when they are actually sample data. You'll usually see this triggered if you're running something like the landing page report that requires a lot of memory. You'll see a little yellow banner at the top right that will say this report was based on 5% of visits. And usually the algorithm is close enough to give you an idea of the trend, but not enough to give you an exact figure that you may or may not be looking for.
So the other thing to remember about this is that Google Analytics works through, as Nate mentioned, through a JavaScript code, but it works through website cookies. Most people at this point are familiar with cookies. It's what kind of tracks your engagement on your site. It's what allows you to do things like, save passwords. It's what allows you to be able to know, hey, did you visit certain pages in the past? Cookies really just track your behavior on the web. Now, you can delete cookies. As a user, you can go into your settings in your browser and actually delete your cookies and to make sure that you don't see any retargeting ads anymore, and make sure that there's no sort of kind of saved history about your behavior on the web. Now, not an overwhelming percentage of people delete their cookies, but as a marketer that's looking at your analytics to make decisions, you should understand that this is not representative of 100% of the people that reached your site. This is representative of the people who reached your site that have cookies enabled. people who delete their cookies will no longer show, they'll show as new visitors every time, even if they continue to visit your site over and over again. You may be, deleting your cookies may allow you to come in as organic traffic repeated over and over again. You can actually disable Google Analytics tracking. So even if you've got your people who delete their cookies on a regular basis, you also have people who say, I don't want my behavior to be tracked by different Google Analytics software. Google actually makes that as a publicly available option that you can opt out of having your engagement on Google Analytics tracked. Now you have to, that is a conscious decision you have to make. The default is that you are opted in, but understanding that there are people who delete their cookies, that disable their tracking, that will not be reflected in your web analytics.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember about cookies is that it is browser based. And actually just this afternoon, I was making my way through a very lengthy financial article on a financial blog, and I started at work on my work computer, read a little bit, but then later on I loaded up on my phone, read it a little bit more, then loaded up on my desktop computer with Chrome, finished reading it, closed it out, but then I remember there was one part of it that I wanted to reference, and I went back. My wife's had the Mozilla Firefox browser open, so I went to the article there and got the bit of information. All of that was in many ways one visit, but if you counted up, that would have counted as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate visits generated by, and I would have been tracked with 5 separate cookies. And so there's a lot of smart people working on this to try and figure out how to track between devices. But as long as we're in the cookie-based world, it's something you really have to consider, and to remember that there's going to be a lot of that margin of error that we're kind of coming back to.
Now, what gets a little frustrating about this, and I'm sure everybody's kind of sitting there thinking, it's like, well, what do we do about this? Why are you telling us this if there's nothing that we can do about it? Because it's important to understand. It's important to recognize that you're not making decisions based, you're still making decisions based on sample data. Whether it's what Google is doing as far as filtering out using representative samples, or if you're looking at, understanding that a certain percentage of people will opt out from cookies, will opt out from tracking, that a certain percentage of people may have multiple touch points from multiple machines or devices that will be registered as one visit. It's just to have kind of a healthy questioning of the analytics that you can go in there and be able to say, does this make sense? Things like we saw our traffic, we talked about the spam bots. If we see our traffic all of a sudden that averages 100 visits a day, and then overnight we've got 200 visits, we don't want to go and call start the encyclopedia factory up. We want to be able to say, all right, let's have a healthy understanding that there may be something here that isn't entirely accurate. And so that's why we point out these things to you. It's not to say that there's a solution to be able to get more people to maintain their cookies or to convince people to enable tracking. It's to understand that there are shortcomings and limitations of Google Analytics. Despite the fact that it has so much information, there are still shortcomings that we want you to be aware of.
All right, so that sort of covers the data set part of analytics, what to be aware of, what can skew the data, what can force you to look at trends and not exact numbers. But there's another part of analytics that we really need to consider, and that's attribution, especially if you're tracking sales or you're tracking leads and you really want to understand what marketing activities are doing the best, where should you reinvest and where should you divest. And it's important to not only understand how your traffic is coming into your site and what it's doing, but also what can skew and what should you consider when attributing a goal conversion or a sale to these different visits that are coming into the site.
Right. And when we talk about attributing, that term attribution gets thrown out a lot in the, and especially in the marketing world. But really what it boils down to is being able to determine cause and effect. When we talk about attribution, we want to be able to tell the story of what happens. We want to go to, if it's a police that go to a crime scene, they know what happened at the very, very end. They want to know how they got to the body in the middle of the alleyway. We talk about attribution. We know that it's not necessarily a linear approach to it. So we don't want to just look at our last click. We want to be able to look at the returning visitors. We want to break down by channel. We want to understand all the different elements of this story and of the puzzle that contributed to that final last click, because that's where our attribution is. We know that at the end of the day, this direct visit drove a sale. When we talk about attribution, we want to be able to understand what other visits or what other touch points may have contributed to that sale, even though that the actual conversion itself is being tied back to the direct visit.
Yeah, and so it's not just a last click versus first click. Did someone come into organic and then come back via direct and convert? That's an amazing report. It's in the multi-channel funnels report, and it's something that should definitely be understood. But there's even other things like, do you have internal company traffic? Are you tracking the right IP addresses? Are you going to the site a lot of times during the day and doing test conversions that are being tracked as real conversions? And we could do a whole episode on just attribution, but coming back to the theme of even considering things like international traffic, if you're an e-commerce site that only ships in the US, and seeing what of that international traffic is converting or is not converting and how that relates to your business, and considering all these different dimensions and not just looking at the raw numbers, but how do they fit into the story of your business?
No, and I think international traffic is always interesting to me because when you bring that up to most people, they say, oh, I don't get any traffic internationally. Nate, how many times have you heard that when you brought up this idea of kind of international, that you're just like, oh, I just don't get any international traffic?
All the time, even though the internet is around the world just as it is in the United States.
Absolutely. And you can actually go in there. If you go into things like your acquisition report in Google Analytics, you can see where your users are coming from and from what countries. My personal blog, you would think that, my personal blog only really goes out to people that I talk to. 50% of my traffic comes from outside the US. And this is not said, I'm not targeting outside the US. It comes from, in the past year, it comes from 161 different countries. The US being 50% of the traffic, but 161 different countries drove at least one visit to just my personal website where I talk about things like what I did for Christmas or how, what I did to celebrate our honeymoon. This is not like a super involved marketing blog that has a wide variety of people who would be interested because they know me from a marketing perspective. Nate, I'm sure you could even give us some, information about the international stats on your blog, but really what this gets down to is knowing that your assumptions of your audience, it's just people. I know what my audience is. I know where they're coming from. Test those assumptions. That's been an ongoing theme here at Bamboo Chalupa, where you got to test those assumptions and know whether or not the majority of your traffic actually comes from the US. If you don't ship internationally and you're looking at your statistics saying, hey, we're up 50% year over year, but all of that traffic is coming from international sources that you can't convert from, are you really up from a business perspective? Is the website really performing better than it did last year?
Yeah, and we could go on and on with all the different dimensions to look at, and looking at all those different dimensions and in the context of really working with sample data, with SKU data in some ways. But I think the main takeaway for this section, before we really dive into what to do about it, is that it's important to look at trends and not specific data points. It's to build your business over the fact that quarter over quarter, we've had a significant increase in organic traffic and social traffic, and that should inform our strategy. It's not to say this year we had 1,587 visits and they had a 80% bounce rate. That is a good fact, and just to leave it at that. It's to look at how the trends are growing, what context they're growing or declining in, and what can you take away to actually do about that.
And remember what Nate said at the very beginning, that analytics is more than just numbers. It's a story. They want to tell us what happened, but why, how, and how that influences our ongoing approach.
All right, so let's quickly run through what to do about it. So we're working with SKU data, sample data, where we can't exactly attribute what's going on where, but we can look at trends. First off, I would say, understand the terminology that you're looking at in Google Analytics. A lot of the terms seem straightforward, or they seem overly daunting for really a simple concept. Things like conversion rate or bounce rate. You don't have to be an analytics expert to understand or pull a quick definition off GA's website, or to do a quick Google search, and to understand why that metric matters and why it appears in Google Analytics. you can make sure that you're not looking at single metrics to make decisions. I think about this especially in the context of website engagement. If you just look at average time per session, but you don't look at bounce rate or pages per visit, you're come away with a very misinformed takeaway, especially if you're working with skew data or, things that we've talked about before that can influence website engagement, like bot traffic or, irrelevant website traffic that for some reason shows up on one page of your site and dwells there.
Right. And we want to look also at, things that are relative, your data points. We want to be comparing apples to apples here. We want to have a relative comparison between what we're looking at. If you want to tell me that my Facebook traffic has your Facebook traffic is so much worse because it bounces at 2 times the percentage that my organic traffic bounces at. It's like, well, think about what that traffic is. Somebody coming in from Facebook probably saw an article that appealed to them on Facebook, clicked, that's all they were interested in, read the article and left. Doesn't mean that traffic was not valuable for us. It doesn't mean that it's saying, well, that's half as valuable as the traffic from the organic listing because they viewed 3 other pages. It just says that relative to the goals of that particular channel, that performed really well because we expect that traffic to bounce. It's having a little bit of a qualitative understanding of what these metrics mean. And like Nate said, you can go ahead, you can Google any of those. Twitter and Facebook are great opportunities. There's a lot of communities that talk about, beginner resources. You can reach out to Nate and myself on Twitter or through the website, and we'll be able to answer any questions for you. Really the idea here is that we want to be able to understand what these metrics mean so that we can evaluate them relative to the goals that we have for that particular channel.
Yeah, and second off, I would say to look at these metrics with a marketing eye and not to look at it just from a pure data perspective. There's an interesting concept that floats around the web called dark social. And it's basically this idea that even though you can see mediums and source that show up in analytics, the true driver of internet traffic and the true driver of quality internet traffic is people to people sharing on whatever platform they happen to be sharing their articles on. And a good example is that just the other day, me and Brett were talking back and forth, and he was talking about this article that was on YesAware. It's an industry provider. And basically he told me I should go read that. And he IM'd me the link. I clicked on it, skimmed it, and then didn't have time to really read it. But what I did, I put that away in my memory. And after our call, 30 minutes later, I couldn't remember the exact article. I didn't have my IM pulled up, but I did go to Google and typed in, YesAware holiday email article, and popped right up, clicked through. Now, YesAware would see that visit as organic, but where did that really come from? It really came from the fact that YesAware has gotten their content in front of influencers like Brett, who specifically went out and he's telling other people who he knows would be interested in that to go read that. And I think, and that has a huge effect on how your traffic and most importantly, how your conversions happen. That sure, it might have happened to come through Twitter, Facebook, organic, but when you get back to it, it's the person on the other end who's sharing it, looking for it. And the medium, the source that they're using just happens to be the tool in between.
Think about it for anybody that does, think about how internal training works at a lot of companies. Unless if big companies, small companies, massive companies, 2-person companies, when you talk about training, more often than not, unless there is an entirely fleshed out training program that is all proprietary information, which in my professional experience is extremely rare, people will pull from resources from the web. Now, they may go and Google these resources on their own. They may tell people, and I do this all the time with the folks that I work with. It's like, oh, I read this great article a couple of weeks ago. You should go and check this out on so-and-so's website. I'm now telling them the website. I'm telling them the subject of the article. They now know what to look for. It wasn't necessarily a wholly organic, conversion there, as far as conversion being just the click through to the website. It was something that was pushed forward based on my recommendation. But think about this in the context of any training that you would do at your company. If somebody recommends that you go and you read an article, but they don't actually tell you exactly what it is or give you the URL, there's no way to track what somebody recommends to you in an offline world. As Nate mentioned before, there are engineers at Google and kind of in the not so dark recesses of their of the Googleplex that want to be able to understand how they can track all sorts of online or offline engagement. There are people who are talking about different purchases in store by being able to say whether or not the actual, if your e-commerce app, if it was accessed from within the store, they will actually be able to show how that attributes back to the conversion. Now, there's a lot of people who are working on this, but this idea of dark social, which is really quite fascinating, is the idea that as Nate mentioned before, our peer-to-peer sharing network is what really drives information distribution across the web and not on the web. But when we're talking about web assets, websites, content that exists on a website, people share that information on a daily basis. And the way that information gets passed from person to person is not necessarily one of your primary channels that Google Analytics will track, your direct referral, organic, or paid channels. This is this kind of fifth element, as if you will, in terms of how people find and distribute content across the web.
All right. So main takeaway, analytics is extremely powerful. It can be skewed. So it's important to look at trends and to understand the people behind the visits and to understand why they're coming to your website and what story that tells about your site and your business. All right, so Brett, let's wrap this up by sharing a couple tips that go beyond just basic analytics. So what are a couple ways that you have found useful to really improve your usage of analytics day in and day out?
Sure. So I'll go with two of them here. I'll go with one of the biggest things, one of the most valuable kind of training sessions that I ever had was to learn regular expressions, or regex, as you may have heard that before. And these are just very basic symbols that exist that you can use to filter traffic in Google Analytics. For example, the pipe bar is almost viewed as an or statement. So if I want to go in there and I want to filter traffic and I want to say referral traffic that comes from sister website 1 or sister website 2, I can use the pipe bar, drop both of those URLs in there, and I can filter all that information in one fell swoop. It lets me be a lot more agile in the way that I'm able to analyze data because I can filter it on the fly. Now, the other one that I would really kind of go with as far as getting better is to get an understanding of dashboards. In Google Analytics, I think dashboards are one of those things that everybody loves the theory of them. Everybody says, hey, it would be great to be able to see everything I'm looking for in just in one screenshot. Now that exists. Dashboards exist to simplify your data. You have to make sure that they're built in a way that actually addresses what you as the marketer need. I would almost even recommend not trying to find a corporate level dashboard, but find one that works for you personally to say what's important to you so that you can get a snapshot of, hey, has organic traffic spiked? Has traffic to a particular landing page spiked? Is traffic from different channels as a percentage of the whole changed month over month, week over week? So understanding regular expressions, understanding dashboards. And I'll throw a third one out there as well. We talked about regular expressions. We talked about dashboards. I also want you guys to look into Google Alerts and Google Alerts in Analytics, not the Google Alerts, if something is triggered on an organic result. But Google Analytics you can actually set alerts for yourself to say, hey, if traffic to a particular web page goes to 0, I want to get an email. If traffic from a new referrer drives more than 100 visits, I want to get an email. Because all of this helps you understand your analytics and you get pinged with valuable information right away without having to rely on your weekly, monthly, or daily checks to be able to come across that.
I love that. All right. My two quick things. One is learn to use segments. So this is a way when you are on your main analytics dashboard, you can select a segment that basically strips out all the traffic except for that one segment. So for example, if you just want to look at how organic traffic is doing, instead of going to the acquisition and traffic and sorting by organic and looking at that dashboard there, you can apply a segment to just look at organic traffic, and you can click through analytics and use all the reports, behavior, conversion, everything, and you'll just be looking at organic traffic. And you can set up custom segments. It's a really cool way to easily slice and dice the data. Second off, learn how to implement multiple views. So most people have one view by default. They were formerly called profiles, but it's a great idea to have multiple views. One, to back up your data, but also to where if you want to have a cleaner look at your analytics, then you can set up a view with all, with the things filtered out that you want to filter out. And this especially plays into the bot traffic, where you always want to maintain one view that has all the raw, unfiltered data. But if you are seeing just a lot of referrer spam, then you can figure out a way, and we'll link to an article in the show notes on how to filter out most of that, say with a host name filter. And you can create a second view that will have all of that filtered out. And then that will allow you to have a filter view without ruining your historical data that you may have in your original view. So learn how to set that up, play around with it. All right. Well, you can find previous episodes and links to all the things that we mentioned and our contact information at bamboochalupa.com. And if you don't want to miss another episode, please go subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcast app. And wherever you go, please leave a comment and rating while you're there. We learn a lot from your feedback, and your ratings helps others discover the show. So for Brett Snyder, I'm Nate Shiver. Thank you for listening.